The Buck with the Tire, a story of rescue and redemption. Part 1. When the forest called for help. The morning mist hung heavy over the pine forests of northern Germany, creating a ghostly curtain between the ancient trees. Dr. Elena Hartmann had been a wildlife veterinarian for 18 years, but the call that came through her radio at 6:47 a.m. that Tuesday morning still made her heart skip a beat. "Doc, we've got a situation on Highway B27, crackled the voice of Ranger Marcus Weber. It's a white-tailed buck. Young male, maybe 3 years old. He's got a tire around his neck." Elena set down her coffee cup slowly, already mentally cataloguing the equipment she'd need. A tire. Of all the human debris that ended up entangling wildlife, tires were among the worst, heavy enough to exhaust the animal, rigid enough to prevent normal feeding, and nearly impossible for the creature to remove on its own. "How long?" she asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "Hard to say. At least a couple of days, judging by the wear patterns on the ground where he's been trying to scrape it off. Maybe longer." He's still mobile, but Elena, Marcus paused, and in that pause, she heard everything he didn't want to say. He's getting weak. Before we continue with this remarkable rescue, take a moment to consider, when was the last time you witnessed true gratitude from an animal? Drop a comment below with your experience, because what happened 6 months after this rescue would challenge everything the team thought they knew about deer behavior and memory. The rescue team assembled with the efficiency born of years of practice and too many heartbreaking close calls. By 7:15 a.m., 5 vehicles were converging on the location. Elena's mobile veterinary unit, 2 police cars to manage traffic, a specialized wildlife rescue van, and the Forest Service truck carrying Marcus and his partner, Jennifer Chen, a young conservation officer, on her first major rescue. Jennifer had only been with the Forest Service for 8 months. She joined after completing her master's degree in wildlife biology, her thesis on white-tailed deer behavior patterns in fragmented habitats. She thought she understood these animals from her research, from the countless hours observing them through binoculars and trail cameras. But seeing this buck, this magnificent creature, reduced to exhausted stumbling by a piece of human garbage, made her realize how much she still had to learn about the intersection of wild lives and human carelessness. "First time seeing something like this?" asked Thomas Kowalski, the emergency wildlife specialist who'd driven up from Munich. At 53, Thomas had seen enough to fill several lifetimes of nightmares and miracles. His hands, scarred from countless rescues, were already checking the tranquilizer equipment with practiced precision. "First time in person," Jennifer admitted, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "We studied cases in university, but it's different when you can smell the fear, hear the labored breathing," Thomas finished. "That's good. Never lose that feeling. The day this stops affecting you is the day you should find another job." The deer stood at the forest's edge, about 30 meters from the road. The tire, a large truck tire by the look of it, hung around his neck like the world's cruelest necklace. His head drooped from the weight, and even from a distance, they could see where the rubber had worn away patches of fur, leaving raw, angry skin beneath. His ribs showed more prominently than they should for a deer in early autumn, when food was still plentiful. "Poor fellow probably hasn't been able to graze properly," murmured Dr. Hartmann, studying him through binoculars. "The tire prevents him from lowering his head to the right angle. He's been trying to browse on tree bark and higher vegetation, but it's not enough." The buck's eyes, those liquid brown pools that held the wisdom of the wild, tracked their movements with a mixture of exhaustion and wariness. He'd clearly been trying to remove the tire himself. The base of nearby trees showed fresh scrape marks, and the ground was churned where he'd pawed at it in frustration. "We need to move fast but careful," Elena announced to the assembled team. "He's weak, but adrenaline could give him enough strength to bolt. If he runs deeper into the forest with that tire, we might lose our chance." The rescue plan unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Marcus and Jennifer would approach from the north, gently herding the deer toward a small clearing where Thomas had set up the capture net. The police officers, led by Chief Inspector Wilhelm Braun, would ensure no traffic stopped to gawk. Nothing spooked wildlife faster than a crowd of onlookers with phone cameras. Elena would be ready with the tranquilizer gun, though she hoped to avoid using it. In his weakened state, the buck might not handle the drugs well. "Remember," Thomas said to Jennifer as they took their positions, "he's more afraid of us than we are of him. We're predators in his eyes. Every instinct he has is screaming at him to run. The only reason he hasn't is because he's too exhausted." Jennifer nodded, gripping her radio tighter. She thought about her thesis research, about the hours she'd spent documenting how white-tailed deer communicated danger to each other through scent marks and body language. Right now, this buck was probably sending out every distress signal his species knew, and somewhere in the forest, other deer were receiving that message, learning to fear this place. The approach began at 7:43 a.m. Marcus moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent 30 years in these forests. He knew every tree, every game trail, every subtle shift in the wind that might carry their scent to the frightened animal. Jennifer followed his lead, placing her feet exactly where he did, breathing when he breathed. The buck's head came up, nostrils flaring. For a moment, everyone froze. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, ancient pines standing as silent witnesses to this delicate moment between human intention and animal instinct. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, though he knew the deer couldn't understand his words. Perhaps it was the tone that mattered, the same gentle cadence he'd used with his own children when they were small and frightened. "We're here to help." The deer took a stumbling step backward, the tire swaying pendulously around his neck. The movement clearly pained him. They could see him wince, his legs trembling from the effort of supporting both his body weight and the additional 20 kilograms of rubber. "Doctor." Hartmann watched through her scope, finger poised near the trigger of the tranquilizer gun. She'd made this shot hundreds of times, could calculate the drug dosage based on the animal's estimated weight and condition without conscious thought. But she waited. Every intervention carried risk. In the deer's weakened state, even a perfectly calculated dose of sedative could tip him over the edge from exhaustion to cardiac arrest. "He's moving toward the net," Thomas's voice crackled over the radio. "Jennifer, shift 2 meters to your left. We need to keep him centered." The young conservation officer moved as instructed, her heart pounding so loud she was certain the deer could hear it. This was what she'd dreamed of when she chose this career, not the paperwork and meetings that filled most of her days, but this, being part of the thin line between human impact and wildlife survival. The buck took another step, then another. His movements were becoming more agitated, the primitive part of his brain overriding exhaustion with a need to escape. The tire caught on a low branch, jerking his head sideways. He made a sound then, not quite a grunt, not quite a wheeze, but something that spoke of frustration and fear in equal measure. "Now," Thomas commanded. The net deployment was swift and precise. Thomas and his assistant, Maria Fernandez, a volunteer rescuer who'd driven 2 hours to help, triggered the mechanism simultaneously. The weighted edges of the specially designed capture net sailed over the buck, settling around him like a gossamer cage. For a moment, the deer went absolutely still, as if trying to process this new development. Then he exploded into motion, or tried to. The net, designed to tangle more tightly the more an animal struggled, did its job. Within seconds, the buck was on the ground, sides heaving, eyes rolling white with panic. "Move in, move in," Elena commanded, abandoning her sniper position to sprint toward the captured animal. "We have maybe 3 minutes before the stress becomes dangerous." The team converged on the deer like a medical trauma unit, which, in essence, they were. Elena immediately began her assessment, checking heart rate, respiratory rate, looking for injuries beyond the obvious neck trauma. Thomas and Maria worked to stabilize the deer's position, ensuring he could breathe properly despite the tire's weight. "Pulse is rapid but strong," Elena reported. "Some infection around the neck wounds, but not as bad as I feared. The tire's been moving enough to prevent severe pressure necrosis. We can do this." The actual removal of the tire proved to be its own challenge. It had somehow slipped over the deer's head when his antlers were smaller, probably in late spring when he was exploring a dump site or abandoned area. Now, with his antlers grown to magnificent 10-point spread, there was no way to simply slide it off. We need to cut it, Thomas decided, producing a battery-powered reciprocating saw from his kit. But carefully, one slip and we could injure him worse than the tire has. The sound will terrify him, Jennifer worried. That's where you come in, Elena said, surprising the young officer. I need you to cover his eyes, talk to him. Your voice is calmer than the rest of ours right now. Sometimes that makes all the difference. Jennifer knelt by the buck's head, gently placing a cloth over his eyes. She could feel him trembling through her hands, violent shivers that ran through his entire body. She started talking, not even sure what she was saying. She told him about her thesis, about the deer she'd watched in the nature preserve near her university. She told him about her grandmother's garden, where deer would come to eat the roses despite every deterrent they tried. The saw's whine cut through the morning air, and the buck flinched. Jennifer kept talking, her voice steady even as tears gathered in her eyes. This magnificent creature, brought low by human carelessness, trusting them in his most vulnerable moment even as every instinct screamed danger. Almost there, Thomas muttered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning. The tire was thick, industrial grade. It fought the saw blade, rubber smoking slightly from the friction. Just another minute. That minute stretched like an eternity. Maria monitored the deer's breathing. Marcus kept watch for other wildlife that might be attracted by the commotion. The police officers maintained their traffic barrier, turning away 3 cars full of curious onlookers who wanted to stop and watch. Then, with a final grinding protest, the tire separated. Thomas and Elena carefully pulled the 2 halves away from the deer's neck, revealing the full extent of the damage. The fur was completely worn away in a band around his neck, the skin raw and inflamed. There were infected scratches where he'd caught the tire on branches, and the beginning of what could have become dangerous pressure sores. Could have been worse, Elena murmured, immediately beginning to clean and treat the wounds. Much worse. Another week, and we'd have been looking at systemic infection, maybe permanent nerve damage. She worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wounds with saline, applying antibiotic ointment, and injecting a long-acting antibiotic to combat the infection. The deer had stopped struggling, lying still except for the rapid rise and fall of his flanks. Is he going into shock? Jennifer asked, worried by the sudden stillness. No, Thomas said, a note of wonder in his voice. Look at his eyes. Jennifer carefully lifted a corner of the cloth. The deer's eye was visible, that liquid brown pool no longer showing white with panic. Instead, he was watching them with something that looked almost like understanding. Sometimes they know, Elena said softly. Not always, but sometimes they understand we're trying to help. It's not very scientific to say so, but after 18 years of this work, I've seen it enough to believe it. The team had 3 options at this point. What would you have chosen? Share your thoughts below. There's no wrong answer when lives hang in the balance. They could keep the deer for observation at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, release him immediately to minimize human contact, or monitor him on site until he recovered from the immediate trauma. Elena made the call. We release him here, but we stay close. He needs time to recover from the sedation effects of stress, and I want to make sure he can move properly without the tire's weight. They carefully removed the net, everyone stepping back, except for Jennifer, who was last to retreat from the deer's side. For a moment, nothing happened. The buck lay there, free for the first time in days, perhaps weeks, but seemingly unable to process this sudden change. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. Without the tire's weight, the movement seemed to surprise him. He lifted it higher, then higher still, as if rediscovering the natural range of motion he'd been denied. His ears swiveled, taking in the sounds of the forest without the constant scraping of rubber against fur. Come on, boy, Marcus whispered. You can do it. The deer rolled onto his chest, front legs gathering beneath him. With visible effort, he pushed himself up, back legs following. He stood swaying for a moment, like a sailor finding land legs after months at sea. Then he took a step, another. His head turned, and for just a moment, his eyes met Jennifer's. This next part still gives the rescue team chills when they remember it. If you've ever had a moment of connection with wildlife, you'll understand what happened next. The buck didn't bolt, didn't bound away in the typical whitetail flash of raised tail and powerful leaps. Instead, he stood there for nearly 30 seconds, simply looking at them. His gaze traveled from Jennifer to Elena to Thomas to Marcus, as if memorizing each face. Then, with a dignity that seemed almost deliberate, he turned and walked, not ran, walked into the forest, disappearing into the morning mist like a ghost returning to its realm. Did that just happen? Jennifer breathed. It did, Thomas confirmed, his usual professional demeanor cracking to show genuine amazement. In 30 years of rescues, I've seen that maybe 3 times. When they look at you like that, it changes you. Elena was already packing up her medical supplies, but her hands moved automatically while her mind replayed that moment of eye contact. She'd felt something pass between them, the deer and the humans. Not gratitude, that was too human a concept, but acknowledgement, perhaps. A recognition of aid given and received. Will he be okay? Jennifer asked. The antibiotics will handle the infection, Elena replied. The wounds will heal. Deer are remarkably resilient. The psychological trauma, that's harder to predict. Some animals bounce back quickly, others remain skittish, avoiding areas where they experience trauma. As the team packed up their equipment, the forest gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Birds resumed singing, having gone silent during the rescue. A squirrel chattered indignantly from a pine tree, as if scolding them for disturbing the morning peace. The mist was beginning to burn off as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full glory of the autumn forest in shades of green and gold. Same time next week? Thomas asked with dark humor as he loaded the net apparatus into his van. God, I hope not, Elena replied, but she was smiling. Though if there is a next time, I couldn't ask for a better team. Chief Inspector Braun approached as they were preparing to leave. Impressive work, he said, his formal police demeanor softening. My daughter is studying to be a veterinarian. Days like this remind me why I support her choice, even though I worry about her constantly. Tell her the worry never goes away, Elena said. But neither does the feeling you get from days like this. When it works, when you save one, it makes every difficult day worthwhile. As the vehicles began to disperse, Jennifer lingered, looking back at the spot where the deer had disappeared into the forest. Marcus noticed and walked over to stand beside her. First major rescue is always memorable, he said. You did good today. That deer is alive because you kept him calm during the critical moments. I just talked to him, Jennifer said, embarrassed. You connected with him, Marcus corrected. That's a gift. Not everyone has it. The technical skills, the knowledge, those can be taught. But that instinct to connect, to understand what an animal needs in its moment of crisis, that's what makes the difference between a good wildlife officer and a great one. As they drove away, Jennifer couldn't shake the image of the buck's eyes, that moment of connection before he walked back into his world. She thought about her thesis, about all the data and charts and scientific analysis she'd compiled about deer behavior. None of it had prepared her for the reality of looking into those eyes and seeing not just an animal, but a being with its own understanding of the world, its own way of processing trauma and relief. That night, she would go home and write in her journal, trying to capture the feeling of the deer's heartbeat under her hands, the way his trembling had gradually stilled as she talked to him. She would write about Thomas's scarred hands, so gentle despite their strength, about Elena's quiet competence, the way she could assess and act without hesitation, about Marcus's deep knowledge of the forest, reading signs in disturbed earth and broken branches like others might read a book. But she would write most about the deer himself, about his dignity in suffering, his trust in their most vulnerable moment, and that long, measuring look before he returned to the wild. She would wonder where he was, whether the other deer would accept him back, despite the human scent he now carried, whether he would remember them. 6 months later, she would have her answer in the most unexpected way. The rescue was officially logged as case in the department's files. The photos Maria had taken would be used in training materials and awareness campaigns about the importance of proper waste disposal. Local news picked up the story, running a brief segment about the successful rescue with footage of the team at work. But for those who were there, it was never just case. It was the day the forest called for help, and humans answered. It was proof that the divide between wild and civilized wasn't as wide as it sometimes seemed. It was a reminder that every piece of trash carelessly discarded could become a death trap, but also that there were people willing to drop everything on a Tuesday morning to save a single deer. Dr. Elena Hartmann would perform dozens more rescues in the coming months. Thomas would continue crisscrossing the country, bringing his expertise to wildlife in crisis. Marcus would patrol the same forests he'd known since childhood, reading the subtle signs of animals in distress. And Jennifer would grow into her role, becoming known for her unusual ability to calm frightened animals. But they would all remember the buck with the tire. They would remember the weight of that rubber prison, the infection starting to spread, the exhaustion in his eyes. They would remember the delicate precision required to cut through industrial-grade rubber while a frightened animal lay beneath their hands. Most of all, they would remember that moment when he stood free, looking back at them with those liquid brown eyes that held the wisdom of the wild. The forest had called for help that misty Tuesday morning, and they had answered. But what none of them knew yet was that 6 months later, when Dr. Elena Hartmann would face the greatest crisis of her career, it would be the forest's turn to answer her call. The buck they saved would play a role none of them could have imagined, in a reversal that would remind them all why they chose this life of service to the wild. For now, though, the immediate crisis was over. The tire that had threatened to become a death sentence lay in 2 pieces in the back of Thomas's van, destined for proper disposal. The deer was free, the infection would be conquered by antibiotics, and the wounds would heal. The team dispersed to their regular duties, carrying with them the quiet satisfaction of a life saved. But the story was far from over. In fact, the most remarkable chapter was yet to be written. This rescue was possible because of dedicated professionals and volunteers. If this story moves you, consider supporting your local wildlife rescue organization. Share this story to spread awareness about the impact of improper waste disposal on wildlife. Part 2. When the forest returned the favor. 6 months later, the gratitude arc. The late March rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the forest roads into rivers of mud and making every rescue call twice as dangerous. Dr. Elena Hartmann squinted through her windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. It was nearly midnight, and she'd been called out for an emergency. A pregnant doe had been hit by a car and needed immediate attention. "This weather is insane," she muttered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tighter as her mobile veterinary unit skidded slightly on the muddy forest road. The same road, she realized with a start, where they'd rescued the buck with the tire 6 months ago. The forest looked different in the storm, menacing rather than mystical, full of shadows that seemed to leap at her headlights. Elena had taken this back route to avoid a fallen tree on the main highway. It was a decision that would save her life, though she didn't know it yet. The emergency call had come from a young couple who'd accidentally struck the doe while driving home from dinner. They'd stayed with the injured animal, calling for help and trying to keep her calm. Elena appreciated citizens who cared enough to wait, especially in weather like this. Too often, animals were left to suffer alone after vehicle strikes. Her phone, mounted on the dashboard, buzzed with a text from Jennifer Chen. "Heard you got called out in this mess. Be careful, Doc. Roads are washing out everywhere." 6 months had transformed Jennifer from an uncertain rookie to a confident conservation officer. She'd assisted in dozens of rescues since that morning with the buck, but she still talked about it as her defining moment in wildlife service. Just last week, she'd presented a paper at a regional conference about human-wildlife conflict resolution, using the tire incident as her primary case study. Elena was composing a mental reply when it happened. The mudslide came without warning. One moment she was navigating a particularly steep section of the forest road. The next, the entire hillside seemed to liquefy. Tons of mud, rocks, and fallen trees cascaded across the road. Elena had just enough time to hit the brakes before her van was swept sideways, tumbling down the embankment like a toy thrown by an angry child. The world became a kaleidoscope of breaking glass, shrieking metal, and the sickening sensation of weightlessness punctuated by bone-jarring impacts. The van rolled twice before coming to rest against a massive oak tree. The driver's side crushed inward, the windshield gone, rain pouring through the gaping hole where it had been. Elena tried to move and immediately wished she hadn't. Pain shot through her left leg, definitely broken. Her head throbbed, and when she touched her forehead, her hand came away bloody. The van's engine was dead, all electronics fried. Her phone had been thrown somewhere during the roll. She was alone, injured, in the middle of the forest during the worst storm in a decade. "Help!" she called out, knowing it was useless. No one would be traveling this road in these conditions. The couple waiting with the injured doe were miles away on a different route. It could be morning before anyone realized she was missing, and by then, she tried to assess her situation clinically, the way she would evaluate an injured animal: broken leg, possible concussion, various cuts and bruises. The cold was already seeping in through her wet clothes. Hypothermia would be a real risk. She needed to get out of the van, find shelter, somehow signal for help. But when she tried to move, the pain in her leg made her vision go white. That's when she heard it. A soft snort, barely audible over the rain drumming on the van's roof. Through the shattered windshield, Elena saw a shape in the darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene for a brief moment, and her breath caught. A deer stood not 10 feet from the van, watching her. But not just any deer. This buck had a distinctive pattern of white scarring around his neck, a band where no fur grew. "No," Elena whispered. "It can't be." The buck took a step closer, his magnificent antlers, now fully grown and even more impressive than 6 months ago, catching the intermittent lightning. His eyes, those same liquid brown pools she remembered, studied her with what looked impossibly like recognition. "It's you," she breathed. "The tire. We cut the tire off you." The buck made another sound, softer this time, almost like the whicker of a horse. He turned his head toward the forest, then back to her, repeating the gesture. "I can't," Elena said, feeling slightly insane to be talking to a deer. "My leg is broken. I can't walk." The buck approached the van, close enough that Elena could have touched him if the door hadn't been crushed shut. He lowered his massive head, looking directly at her through the opening where the windshield had been. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the injured human and the healed deer. Then the buck did something extraordinary. He began to paw at the ground beside the van, his hooves striking something solid. Elena heard a metallic scraping sound and realized he was clearing debris from the passenger door. The door that might still open. Are you trying to help me?" Elena asked, wonder overcoming pain for a moment. The buck continued his work, methodically clearing branches and mud from the passenger side of the van. When he finished, he stepped back and made that soft sound again, clearly directed at her. Elena understood. As impossible as it seemed, the deer was trying to get her out of the van. Using her arms and her one good leg, she painfully dragged herself across the center console. Every movement was agony, but the buck's presence somehow gave her strength. If this animal could survive weeks with a tire around his neck, she could manage to crawl a few feet. The passenger door was damaged, but not destroyed. Elena pushed against it with her good leg, and on the third try, it creaked open. Rain immediately soaked her, but she was already so wet, it hardly mattered. She managed to pull herself partially out of the van before her strength gave out. "I can't," she gasped. "I'm sorry, I just can't go any further." The buck moved closer, so close she could smell his wild scent, pine needles and earth, and something indefinably free. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to the ground beside her, his legs folding beneath him in the same position she'd seen him assume when they'd removed the tire. He turned his head to look at her, and the message was clear. "You want me to hold on?" Elena asked, hardly believing what was happening. The buck remained perfectly still, waiting. With trembling hands, Elena reached out and grasped the base of his antlers. They were warm, solid, real. This was actually happening. The deer she'd saved was now trying to save her. Slowly, carefully, the buck began to stand. Elena held on, using his strength to pull herself up onto her good leg. The pain was excruciating, but she managed to get upright, leaning heavily against the deer's solid shoulder. He stood perfectly still, letting her find her balance. "Now what?" she whispered. The buck took a small step forward, moving so slowly that Elena could hop along beside him, using him as a living crutch. They moved this way, inch by painful inch, away from the destroyed van and toward a rocky overhang Elena hadn't noticed in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter from the worst of the rain. The journey couldn't have been more than 50 feet, but it felt like miles. Several times Elena had to stop, overwhelmed by pain and dizziness. Each time, the buck waited patiently, steady as a rock, until she could continue. When they finally reached the overhang, Elena collapsed, her back against the rock wall. The buck didn't leave. He folded his legs again, lying down beside her in a way that blocked the wind and rain. His body heat radiated against her side, fighting off the hypothermia that threatened to claim her. "Thank you," Elena whispered, her hand finding the scarred ring around his neck, feeling the healthy skin that had grown back over the wounds. "I can't believe you remember. I can't believe you're here." The buck turned his head to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw something that science said shouldn't exist: understanding, memory, and yes, gratitude. They stayed that way for hours, the veterinarian and the deer, waiting out the storm together. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time she woke, the buck was still there, warm and solid against her side. Once, she woke to find two other deer standing nearby, a doe and a younger buck, watching curiously but keeping their distance. The rescued buck made a soft sound to them, and they settled down a few feet away, as if standing guard. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to ease. Elena was shivering despite the buck's warmth, her leg throbbing with each heartbeat. She knew she needed medical attention soon, but she had no way to call for help. That's when she heard the helicopter. The search and rescue chopper swept low over the forest, clearly looking for something or someone. Elena tried to shout, but her voice was barely a croak. The helicopter passed overhead without seeing them, hidden as they were under the overhang. The buck suddenly stood, stepping out into the open. Elena tried to call him back, afraid he would flee from the noise of the helicopter, but he stood his ground in the small clearing, his white tail raised like a flag. "What are you doing?" Elena asked. The buck began to move in a way Elena had only read about in wildlife biology texts, the alert posture deer used to signal danger to their herd. But he wasn't signaling danger. He was making himself as visible as possible, his raised tail flashing white against the dark forest, his magnificent antlers catching the early morning Sunday. The helicopter circled back. "Wait," Elena heard the pilot's voice carry on the wind. "There's something down there, a deer, but it's not running, it's just standing there." The chopper descended lower, and Elena could see the crew inside pointing at the buck. Then one of them spotted her under the overhang. She raised her arm weakly, and suddenly the radio was crackling with activity. "We've got her. We've found Dr. Hartmann. She's injured but alive. Beginning rescue operations." The buck watched as the helicopter landed in a nearby clearing, as the rescue team ran toward them with medical equipment and a stretcher. He didn't flee, even when strangers surrounded Elena, checking her vitals, splinting her leg, preparing her for transport. Jennifer Chen was with the rescue team, having joined the search the moment Elena was reported missing. She stopped dead when she saw the buck, recognizing the distinctive neck scarring immediately. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Elena, is that the one with the tire?" Elena confirmed weakly as they lifted her onto the stretcher. "He stayed with me all night. He saved my life." As the rescue team carried Elena toward the helicopter, she turned back to look at the buck one last time. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. Their eyes met across the distance, and Elena raised her hand in a weak wave. The buck dipped his magnificent head once, a gesture so deliberate it made Jennifer gasp. Then he turned and walked back into the forest, not running, not bounding, but walking with the same dignity he'd shown 6 months ago. The 2 other deer, his family perhaps, fell into step beside him. "Did that just happen?" one of the paramedics asked, his professional composure cracked by wonder. "Did a wild deer just help with a rescue?" "He did more than help," Elena said, as they loaded her into the helicopter. "He saved me, just like we saved him." The story of Elena's rescue spread through the wildlife management community like wildfire. Marcus Weber collected testimony from everyone involved. Thomas Kowalski drove up from Munich to interview Elena in the hospital and examine the scene. The consensus was unanimous. Without the buck's intervention, Elena would have died from hypothermia or her injuries before anyone found her. The scientific community struggled to explain it. Deer didn't behave this way. They didn't remember individual humans after months of separation. They didn't engage in complex rescue behaviors. They didn't show gratitude. Except this one did. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a renowned animal behaviorist from the University of Berlin, came to investigate. She studied the site, interviewed the witnesses, and reviewed all the documentation from both the original rescue and Elena's experience. "What we're seeing," she finally concluded in her report, "is evidence that we've significantly underestimated the cognitive and emotional capabilities of white-tailed deer. The combination of memory, recognition, and apparent gratitude displayed by this animal challenges our fundamental assumptions about ungulate intelligence." But for Elena, recovering in the hospital with her leg in a cast and 17 stitches in her forehead, the scientific explanations didn't matter. What mattered was the memory of those brown eyes, looking into hers, the warmth of the buck's body keeping her alive through the storm, the deliberate way he'd signaled the helicopter. He remembered, she told Jennifer during one visit. "After 6 months, through all the seasons, he remembered us. And when I needed help, he was there." Jennifer had brought Elena's journal from her office, and in it, she'd tucked photos from both rescues, the original images of the buck with the tire, and new ones taken by the search and rescue team showing him standing guard over Elena. "I've been thinking," Jennifer said, "about my thesis, about everything I thought I knew about deer behavior. Maybe we've been so focused on studying them as subjects that we've forgotten to see them as individuals. This buck, he's not just a white-tailed deer exhibiting species-typical behavior. He's an individual with his own experiences, memories, and choices." Elena nodded, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. 20 years I've been doing this job, and he taught me more about the animals we're trying to save than any textbook ever did." The ripple effects of the rescue went far beyond the scientific community. Local news picked up the story, then national media. The tale of the grateful deer who saved his rescuer captured the public imagination in a way that dry conservation statistics never could. Donations to wildlife rescue organizations in the region increased by 300%. The county implemented new regulations about illegal dumping, with heavy fines for anyone caught discarding tires or other dangerous materials in natural areas. 3 new volunteers signed up for Jennifer's conservation program, specifically citing the deer story as their inspiration. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the rescuers themselves. Thomas Kowalski incorporated the story into his training programs, using it to teach new rescuers that the animals they saved were not just statistics or cases, but individuals capable of memory and gratitude. "We're not just removing tires or treating injuries," he would tell his students. "We're saving lives that matter, lives that remember, lives that might one day save ours in return." Marcus Weber, the veteran ranger, found himself looking at the forest differently. Every deer he saw, He wondered about its story, its experiences, its capacity for memory and emotion. He became gentler in his approaches, more patient in his observations, understanding that he was walking through a community of individuals, not just a collection of animals. Chief Inspector Wilhelm Braun, who'd helped with traffic control during the original rescue, made wildlife protection a priority for his department. He instituted regular patrols of known dumping sites and created a rapid response protocol for wildlife emergencies. If they can show that kind of loyalty to us, he told his officers, we owe them at least that much in return. But it was Jennifer who was perhaps most profoundly affected. She abandoned her original thesis and started over, focusing instead on individual variation in wildlife behavior and the capacity for interspecies gratitude. Her research, inspired by the buck's story, would eventually lead to groundbreaking papers on animal cognition and memory. 3 months after the mudslide, Elena returned to work, walking with a slight limp that the doctors said might be permanent. Her first call was to the same forest, a routine check on a bird nesting site. As she drove the repaired road where her accident had occurred, she found herself looking for him, the buck with the scarred neck. She saw him just once more, 2 weeks later, during a different call. She was examining an injured fox when she felt eyes on her. Looking up, she saw him standing at the forest edge, maybe 30 meters away. The scars around his neck had faded to thin white lines, barely visible. He was in his prime now, magnificent and healthy. They looked at each other for a long moment. Elena raised her hands slowly, and the buck dipped his head once before melting back into the forest. It was the last time she would see him, but not the last time she would feel his presence. Other rangers and volunteers would occasionally report seeing a large buck with distinctive neck scarring who seemed unusually calm around humans, who would watch rescue operations from a safe distance, who never fled when the veterinary van passed by. He became something of a legend in the local wildlife management community, the grateful deer, the one who remembered. Years later, when Elena was training a new generation of wildlife veterinarians, she would tell them this story. Some would be skeptical, others enchanted. But she would always end with the same words. Every animal we save has a story, a future, a capacity for experience we're only beginning to understand. That buck taught me that rescue isn't just about the moment we cut away the tire or treat the injury. It's about the life that continues after we're gone, the ripples that spread from one act of compassion. We saved him on a Tuesday morning when the mist clung to the pine trees. 6 months later, on the worst night of my life, he returned the favor. Not because he had to, but because somehow, in his wild heart, he chose to. The forest remembers. That's what Elena learned that night, in the storm. The forest remembers every kindness, every cruelty, every interaction between the wild and the civilized. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it pays us back in ways we never could have imagined. In her final report on the incident, submitted to the International Wildlife Conservation Journal, Elena wrote, "We enter the field of wildlife conservation, believing we are the protectors, the saviors, the ones with the power to make a difference. What we don't always realize is that the relationship goes both ways. The animals we save are not passive recipients of our charity. They are active participants in a complex web of interaction that spans species boundaries. The buck I helped free from a tire didn't just survive, he thrived. And when circumstances reversed, when I was the one trapped and injured, he became the rescuer. This challenges us to reconsider our fundamental assumptions about animal cognition, memory, and emotional capacity. But more than that, it challenges us to see our conservation efforts not as a one-way street of human benevolence, but as an investment in a relationship. Every animal we save has the potential to save us in return, not always as dramatically as in my case, but in countless small ways. They save us from loneliness, from disconnection with nature, from the hubris of believing we are separate from the natural world rather than part of it. The grateful deer, as my colleagues have taken to calling him, is not an anomaly. He is a reminder that the animals we share this world with are far more complex, aware, and capable than we often give them credit for being. In recognizing their capacity for memory and gratitude, we don't anthropomorphize them. We simply acknowledge the full depth of their being. My leg bears the scars of that night in the storm, just as the buck bears the scars around his neck from the tire. We are both marked by our experiences, both survivors of trauma, both beneficiaries of interspecies kindness. In the end, that's what connects us, not our differences, but our shared capacity for suffering and healing, for needing help and providing it. The forest called for help on a misty Tuesday morning, and we answered. 6 months later, I called for help in a storm, and the forest answered through the agency of one remarkable deer. This reciprocity, this balance, this recognition of mutual worth. This is what conservation is really about. Not just saving animals, but acknowledging them as partners in the complex dance of survival we're all engaged in. I've been asked if I think the buck truly understood what he was doing, if he really remembered us and chose to help me. My scientific training tells me to be cautious about such claims, but my experience, lying injured in the storm with a wild deer choosing to warm me with his body to guide rescuers to my location, tells me that understanding takes many forms. Perhaps he didn't understand in the way humans understand, but in his own way, shaped by instinct and experience and something ineffable that connects all living things. He knew, he remembered, he chose to help, and that changes everything. The story spread far beyond scientific journals. It became a cornerstone narrative in wildlife conservation education, told and retold in classrooms and training centers around the world. Children's books were written about the grateful deer. Documentary filmmakers reached out, wanting to recreate the events. But Elena always declined the more sensational offers, protective of the buck's privacy and the dignity of what had transpired between them. In the small German town near the forest, a bronze sculpture was eventually erected, a deer with distinctive scarring around its neck, standing alert and proud. The plaque below read simply, "In gratitude for gratitude given," commemorating the rescue of March 2023 and the reminder that kindness crosses all boundaries. Jennifer Chen, now a senior conservation officer, would often stop by the sculpture on her patrols. She'd think about that first rescue, about the trembling deer under her hands, about Elena's steady voice guiding them all through the crisis. And she'd think about the night of the storm, when roles reversed and the forest itself seemed to reach out to save one of its protectors. "We're all connected," she would tell the new recruits she trained. "Every action matters, every rescue counts, not just for the animal we save, but for the entire web of life we're all part of." That buck taught us that we're not separate from nature, we're part of it, and it's part of us, in ways we're only beginning to understand. The buck lived for many more years, occasionally spotted by hikers and rangers, always recognizable by the faint white scarring around his neck. He sired many offspring, passing on his genes and perhaps something more, a genetic memory of kindness, received and returned. Some swore his descendants showed unusual calmness around humans, though science couldn't confirm such hereditary behavior. When Elena finally retired, 15 years after the incident, she chose to build a small cabin at the edge of the same forest, not to intrude, but to remain close to the wild spaces that had defined her life. On quiet mornings, drinking coffee on her porch, she would sometimes see deer at the forest edge. Whether any of them were descendants of her rescuer, she couldn't say, but she watched them with the same wonder she'd felt that night in the storm, when a wild creature chose to save her life. The last entry in her professional journal, written on her final day as a wildlife veterinarian, read, 40 years of rescuing wildlife, and in the end, I learned that we don't really rescue them at all. We simply return to them what was always theirs, the freedom to live, to thrive, to make choices. And sometimes, if we're incredibly fortunate, they choose to return the favor. The grateful deer taught me that conservation isn't about managing wildlife. It's about recognizing that we're all managing together, all trying to survive and thrive on this small planet. Every scar tells a story. The buck's neck told the story of human carelessness and human compassion. My leg tells the story of nature's fury and nature's grace. Together, they tell a larger story, that the divide between human and animal, civilized and wild, helper and helped, is an illusion. We're all part of the same story, the same struggle, the same hope for survival and meaning. To the buck with the tire, wherever you are now, whether still walking the forest paths or living on only in memory and offspring, thank you. Not just for saving my life, though I'm forever grateful for that. Thank you for showing me, showing all of us, that the animals we dedicate our lives to protecting are not subjects or cases or statistics. They're individuals with memories, choices, and yes, the capacity for gratitude that transcends species. You taught us that every rescue matters because every life matters, and that sometimes, in ways we never expect, the universe balances the scales. We saved you, you saved me, and in doing so, we both saved something larger, the proof that compassion and connection can exist between any two living beings who meet in a moment of need. The forest remembers. And so do I. The end. This story, inspired by real wildlife rescue efforts around the world, reminds us that our actions toward nature always matter. Every piece of trash properly disposed of, every animal aided in distress, every moment of compassion toward the wild creatures we share our world with, it all matters. The animals we help may not always return to save our lives as dramatically as the grateful deer, but they save us nonetheless. From indifference, from isolation from nature, from forgetting that we're all part of the same miraculous web of life. If this story moved you, consider supporting your local wildlife rescue organizations. Share this narrative to spread awareness about the importance of wildlife conservation and the proper disposal of materials that can harm animals. Remember that every action we take ripples outward, affecting lives we may never know about, until, perhaps, one returns when we need it most. The grateful deer lived, Elena lived, and both of their lives were forever changed by 2 moments of interspecies kindness. This is what's possible when we see animals not as other, but as neighbors, fellow travelers, on this small planet we all call home. In memory of all the wildlife rescuers who risk their lives to save animals, and all the animals who, in their own ways, save us right back.